Hey, Moms Off the Record listeners. I'm so excited because today we have Elena Bridgers on, and I've been following her account for so long. I always love whenever I see your reels pop up because it's just the type of wisdom that I am seeking, and it just makes so much sense. And I feel like everything that you say really clicks for the type of listeners that are tuning into this podcast as well. So many of you already know that we had Michaeleen Doucleff of Hunt Gather Parent on, and so many of us love this book. And something that you said that stuck with me for a long time is, it's a wonderful start, and there's so much more to the story. So I'd love to maybe start there, but also let's hear a little bit about like what is your journey? What brought you to this interest in traditional cultures and hunter-gatherer, mothers and how we can apply that to our modern day lives?
Yeah, I get asked this question a lot, and I think every time I answer it a little bit differently. But because it was partly like my training, because my background is in biology. I studied human biology as an undergrad, and so I kind of had this priming to think about human behavior through the lens of evolution and biology, maybe more than other people. But it also was kind of just like an accident of fate. I think that for whatever reason, I was having a very hard time, especially after my second child was born. I had two under two, and I was just drowning. And I just remember thinking, why is this so hard? Like, this is something that women have been doing for millions of years. Like, this is the reason that our species exists. Everyone has always done this. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it shouldn't be hard. Humans are able to do hard things, but what didn't make sense to me was like the really high rates of postpartum depression that we're seeing internationally. The fact that I was just like so sleep deprived that I felt like I could not even function. And yet I was living in a really like safe environment with all the modern conveniences, grocery stores, food delivery, heating and air cooling, So I was like, if I can't do this, like, how did our ancestors do this? That was the question. I don't know why, but I just kept coming back to that question.
Yeah.
And so I read Michaeleen's book, and I loved Michaeleen's book. And yes. I had her on my podcast, and I'm a big fan. But her book is more focused on parenting strategies. And my question was more about like, but what was the social context in which our ancestors mothered? Because I feel like this is impossible. And again, even though I have all these modern conveniences, so yeah, how did people do this 100,000 years ago? And so I started just, reading a lot of academic books and research papers, because there hasn't really been like a mass market book written on this, to my knowledge. And I was like, wow. I was just like floored by what I found. And initially I was like, oh my gosh, I think I'm going to go do a PhD. But then I was like, I feel like there's an opportunity for someone to bring this to a broader audience, because there's a lot of research that's already been done, and it just hasn't made it into the mainstream. And I think it would really benefit mothers to have access to this information in a way that's like a little less jargony and more easy to understand.
Totally. So some of the recent reels that really stood out to me, well, one was about, I think it's one of your pinned ones. It's about interpregnancy or intrapregnancy spacing. And is it the case that our hunter-gatherer predecessors, they would typically have their first child at around 19 and then approximately 4 children spaced each 4 years apart?
Yeah, so there's a lot of debate on this, and it does vary between societies. So there are some societies where the interbirth interval seems to be shorter than that. But in general, I think it is safe to say that the interbirth interval in our evolutionary past, so back when humans lived as hunter-gatherers, was probably much longer on average than it is today. And the reason I think that's true is that if you look at every other ape, the inter-birth interval is closer to like 6 years. In some cases, it's even longer. Like orangutans' inter-birth interval is almost 8 years.
Wow.
And so most evolutionary biologists think that around the time that humans and chimpanzees split, so about 7 million years ago, we had probably like a 6-year interbirth interval also. And the question is then, how did it get shorter, especially given the fact that our children are actually more dependent, more highly dependent, take longer to develop, are
Right.
more work than a chimpanzee baby, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like chimpanzee babies develop much faster. They spend 6 years hanging on their mother's fur and nursing, but then by the time they're weaned, they're like totally self-sufficient. Whereas humans have these really long childhoods, right? Like even in hunter-gatherer societies where children generally become self-sufficient much earlier than they do in our societies, it's usually not until they're like in their late teens that they can really forage for themselves and support themselves without the help of their parents.
Right.
So yeah, and then today we think that a 2-year interbirth interval is the ideal, right?
Right.
And certainly that was my goal. That's what I did. I think it's about 30% of American mothers do when I last looked at the data. And I just think that we're not really meant to have our children that closely spaced.
I agree with you, actually.
Yeah. Which is not to like shame anyone who's done it. Again, I did it, and I think there are some advantages, but it definitely makes it harder. And
It does.
I kind of wish I had known that.
Yeah. My kids are not 2 under 2, but they're 26 months apart. And
Okay.
so everything you're saying completely, I can relate to it, especially because I did a lot of things, which many of my listeners also do, which is, bed sharing from day one and extended breastfeeding. So my whole conflict and the reason why I feel a little bit stuck in this like modern world of, okay, almost 2 under 2, but sometimes practicing like a hunter-gatherer with that is there's always this conflict at play, and like, okay, now we have to set some boundaries with sleeping arrangements, and oh no, I think I read somewhere in one of your older posts, like when your youngest was born and your older child felt a little bit jealous with breastfeeding, and I was like, okay, going through some of that too. And it made a lot of sense once you live through it and you have to closely spaced together, why it is, I mean, in my subjective opinion too, like why it is more ideal to have a larger gap. And I actually recorded a mini episode I'm going to post of why for a potential baby 3 in the future, I'm looking at a 3 to 4 year age gap.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. No, I really support that choice. I mean, the inconvenience of that is that, if you want a large family, you do have to start younger.
Yes.
And you are kind of going to be always in the young child phase, right? Like, I will admit that now that my kids are 4 and 6, and we're kind of moving through the hardest years, and we're done with diapers, and we're done with like the extreme sleep deprivation, and they do kind of play together, that I can see why in the modern context people choose to do things this way, because I think especially for a lot of like professional working women, it's like, well, I want to have my kids, I'm going to have them close, I'm going to get it over with, and then I'm going to like move on to like a new chapter of my life when they're both a little bit older and self-sufficient, and I can like get back to like, bringing my professional activities back to where they were, not maybe where they were pre-baby, but up to almost. So yeah, I totally get it. I get that there are advantages. A lot of women these days choose to wait a lot later in life before having children for legitimate reasons around finances and education and whatnot. And then you don't really have a choice if you want more than one, but to space them closely. But yeah, my experience of having 2 under 2 was honestly really negative. Like I really, if I could do it over, would not do it that way. And I'm going to say this even though I know it's really controversial, because I think it's well supported by the data. If your first child is a boy, mine was, Boys are a little bit needier. Like the data suggests that they take a little bit longer to mature. They're a bit more demanding. Their brains develop a little bit more slowly than baby girls do. And so I think especially when your first child is a boy, there's an argument to be made for holding off a little bit more before you have another. And yeah, my son was devastated by the arrival of my daughter, despite the fact that I did everything to, like, you know, what all of the books said, prepare him, you know, explain. He was pre-verbal. Like, there was no way he could understand what was about to happen. Like, he had no idea until I came home from the hospital with another baby on my breast and his world fell apart. And like shortly after I came home and was breastfeeding, I mean, I literally would have to have another adult take him in another room, or if I was alone with them, I'd have to lock myself in a separate room just to breastfeed her because he was so upset. And then he got really, really sick. He had like croup and all this respiratory stuff, which I think was like a stress response.
Yeah.
And then to this day, managing like jealousy and conflict between the two of them has been the hardest part of my parenting journey. And I think I could have avoided that probably by just waiting another year. And there was no reason. I was 30 when I had my first. So having a second at 33, 34, it would have been no problem. It's just that I had this notion in my head that the 2-year age gap was the ideal.
So interesting. Okay, so we're almost on the same timeline. I had my first at 31, so I'm 35 now. Yes, so my daughter's a year and a half, my son's 3.5. I can totally see what you're saying. Now, I will say, because I can envision some of my listeners panicking if they're about to have their second and it's 2 under 2, like, oh no, it's not all bad news. Like, I will admit very transparently, like that first year, it just was intense, especially the first 3 months. And it does lessen with intensity. And every time you overcome one challenge between your kids, then there's like a new one that will present itself. I do think it makes us more resilient. Is it also very depleting? You know, cortisol inducing? Yes. To your point, like when they're older and more self-sufficient, it is nice to see them play together, like especially envisioning into the future. So don't feel bad, like if this is you in this boat. But it is true. Like we cannot deny the fact that our hunter-gatherer predecessors or our peers, they are spacing out their kids more. And so on that note, I really want to talk to you about lactational amenorrhea, because even in the most holistic communities, if you talk to IBCLCs or moms who breastfeed in the Western world for, let's say, 4 years on end, and they're really doing all the right things, like no pacifiers, bottles pumping. I don't mean right versus wrong, like morally, but I mean all the things to help with lactational amenorrhea. And they think they're truly exclusively breastfeeding. So it used to be the case where if you did all of that direct breastfeeding, you could actually have lactational amenorrhea, I think, I don't know, for 56 days. I don't know, like guaranteed. But now every woman in the Western world will have their own range, because truly I do know women in America who are like, never did the pacifiers, never pumped, no bottles, and my ovulation returned 2 months postpartum. But I'm just thinking like, okay, our hunter-gatherer peers, they're not out there in the wild with their pumps, right? And so, but even, so they're not doing that. But I have so many questions that came up. I was thinking about this in the shower today before I interviewed. I was like, okay, so wait a second. Women have both perceived and true, like low supply and all sorts of other issues that warrant IBCLCs. But I'm just like, are the hunter-gatherers, are they experiencing this? How is it the case? I can't imagine a hunter-gatherer, in the wild with 2 under 2, based on everything I now know. Is it the case, though, that if they are frequently nursing, they are always able to space their babies out, like about 3 to 4 years apart? Are there any hunter-gatherers with kids that are 2 years apart or less by accident? Like, do they have breastfeeding challenges in the same way we do? I know it has to do with like the frequency of the latch-ons, and it's very intense. Can you speak to those nuanced differences?
Yeah. Okay. There's a lot of questions in there.
Yeah.
So I'll start with what I perceived as the first question, which is like, why is breastfeeding not effective birth control in the modern context?
Yeah.
So yeah, I always am very careful to tell people on my Instagram and my Substack that yes, breastfeeding is not an effective form of birth control these days. It was for our ancestors, and the difference is this. First of all, it has something to do, I think, with the frequency of breastfeeding. So there have been some very interesting studies on this from Melvin Connor, who studied the Kung people, exclamation point Kung, also referred to as the Juhansi. And he found that mothers in that society breastfed their infants throughout the first year of life every 13 minutes on average. So we're talking extremely high frequency breastfeeding. Like in the contemporary West, we're often told like make sure to feed them every 2 or 3 hours. Especially for infants in traditional societies, babies are just like constantly on and off the boob. And feeding bouts are shorter, like 2 minutes at a time. Not these like long feeds that we're used to doing. And what he found is that actually the frequency of breastfeeding more than the total amount of time spent breastfeeding was associated with hormonal shifts. So women who breastfed really frequently had lower circulating levels of reproductive hormones in their bloodstream compared with women who were breastfeeding just as much, but who were spacing feeds more. And so I think the fact that, first of all, we just tell women that, they can get away with feeding every 2 hours, the fact that we use, pumps and other tools instead of, putting the baby's mouth to the breast, all of these things change our hormonal profile in such a way that we are more likely to get our periods back more quickly. But before you jump to the conclusion that you can just breastfeed your baby every 13 minutes and that will be birth control, that may not work either, for the simple reason that body mass index is also a factor. So our ancestors were extremely lean. I am not saying this to, shame anyone who, especially new mothers, who are not extremely lean in the modern context. It is hard. I certainly put on a lot of weight with both my kids. But
Same.
In our evolutionary past, that just like wasn't an option. The average BMI for a woman in the hunter-gatherer context is like 18.5 or something. That's like considered borderline unhealthy these days, just because they had to work so hard for their calories and because the foods they were eating were so like starchy and fibrous and generally low calorie. And so that also influences a woman's hormonal profile, both the amount of exercise you're getting and the foods you're eating. So like we know that among certain demographics of like dancers and athletes, even in the contemporary context, if you're working out hard, and especially if you're combining that with like weigh-ins in the case of dancers, like they will lose their period. And so what scientists think is going on is that there's this kind of combination of the hormonal effect of the frequent breastfeeding combined with the diet, exercise, BMI factors that converge, so that really women in hunter-gatherer societies are not seeing the return of their cycle for 3 years after the birth of a baby. But that's just an unrealistic expectation for women these days.
Yeah, fascinating. And I so appreciate the nuance there, right? It's not just about like, oh, I breastfed for 2 years, but my period returned after 2 months. Like, okay, there's something else going on here. It's interesting with my son. And I was a stay-at-home mom, so I mean, I didn't have to pump, which was great because I don't like pumping, but I offered him a bottle only 3 times of pumped milk. He didn't know how to take it because he was like 8 months old. I wanted to go on a date night, so I'm like, whatever, we'll stay home. But my ovulation returned at 12 months postpartum with him. And then with my daughter, who we've bed shared with since day one, moved her to a toddler bed at like, I don't know, 9 months old or something, but we'll bring her back into our bed at around midnight. And I swear from like midnight until 6 a.m., she's nursing on it.
Yeah.
Like it's the frequency, that hunter-gatherer frequency.
Yes.
My son didn't have that. So my ovulation finally just returned like a couple weeks ago. She was 15 and a half months
Wow.
old. And so she's, never had a pacifier, no bottle. I never pumped. And now I get the difference. And I sort of had a hunch like, okay, she did her first ever long stretch, a 6-hour stretch of sleep. She was waking up every 2 to 3 hours. And it was when she finally slept 6 hours on her own, that's when my ovulation returned. So that makes a whole lot of sense. And then also in the Western world, we are told, like, breastfeeding does burn a lot of calories. You want to make sure that you're consuming an additional 500 calories to keep up your milk supply. But it's interesting because it seems like if the hunter-gatherer women are breastfeeding for like maybe 3 years or so, that they don't necessarily need to have the additional 500 calorie surplus. It's possible that, their body's taking from their nutrient stores, like that is possible. But obviously, yeah, they're leaner, they're fitter, they're eating real food, they're not eating McDonald's. So they're getting by just fine, it seems, right?
Yeah. You mentioned the sleep factor, which is something I didn't mention, but I'm a big bed sharing advocate, and I think that's another reason why women get their cycles back so early is that we're discouraged from bed sharing, and yeah, there are some safety concerns around it that are real, but it's true that if you bed share and your baby is feeding at the breast all night, then again, that's going to have an effect on your supply and on your hormonal profile. And that is how all hunter-gatherers sleep with their infants universally. There's really no exceptions to that. So yeah, that's another factor. And yeah, then when it comes to like making up the calorie deficit after the birth of a baby, like I do think that paying attention to your nutrition when you're breastfeeding is really important.
Yes.
Breastfeeding women tend to have a lot of nutritional deficits because both pregnancy and lactation are extremely physiologically demanding processes. And in some cases, like your body will prioritize giving your baby more nutrients than your own body. So your baby could actually be like sapping your supply of omega-3s. And if you're not, eating carefully or taking a supplement, like you do need to pay attention to nutrition. But I do think I am a little bit skeptical of like, oh, you have to eat enough extra calories. I mean, it depends how you feel, right? If you feel hungry, you should eat. If you don't feel hungry, you shouldn't force yourself to eat. I do think that women's bodies are actually designed to be very calorically efficient, especially during the breastfeeding phase, because again, in our evolutionary past, how calories were just hard to come by. So, I mean, in my case, I remember being very hungry when I was breastfeeding, but I also actually didn't lose any weight while I was breastfeeding. I didn't lose any weight until after I stopped breastfeeding because I think that the hormones have an influence too. But
yes, it's interesting. I've heard so many different accounts. Some women, they end up putting on weight. Some women, it's no effect at all. For me, I gradually lose. Like with each pregnancy, I put on, well, with my most recent one, like 45 pounds, even though and I'm only 5'2", so you could really tell. But even though I was very diligent with like diet and exercise, with my first, even more. But then with nursing, by the time my kids were like 6 months old, I was back to normal, but then I would lose dramatically. I think from all the baby wearing, squatting down to picking up messes, like the ancestral movement. I'm still doing that, like, because, they're so like clingy on you between the ages of like 9 months and a year and a half. So even though my daughter can totally walk and run, I'm still holding her on my hip, and I'm probably squatting down, gosh, like, I don't know, 1,000 times a day, picking up, underwear and toys and throwing them elsewhere. And so, yeah, sometimes I wonder, like, am I acting like a hunter-gatherer in my modern world by doing those constant ancestral movements?
Yeah, no, I'm sure you are. I mean, mothers burn a lot of calories.
That.
I mean, baby wearing burns a lot of calories. I mean, if you think about it, I think a lot of people worry about not being able to get back into an exercise routine after a baby comes along because we think that exercise necessarily has to, like, take place in spin class or at the gym, which is like, you can't bring your baby, right? So if you're crunched for time and if especially if you're breastfeeding, it's very hard to do those things. And yet our ancestors got a whole lot of exercise just from going out, gathering, wearing a baby. So, I think, yeah, go for walks, go for long walks wearing your baby.
Yes.
That's like a weighted vest, or just,
Yes.
yeah, do house chores wearing your baby. That's a workout.
Completely agree. I haven't been to a CrossFit gym in, I don't know, 2 years, but the workouts happen within my 1-story home. There's not even stairs, but I'm constantly bending and squatting around. There is no time to sit on the couch and do nothing when you're a mom of two toddlers. There won't be time to do that for years. Now, okay, sleep. We talked about sleep, which brings me to, you recently wrote a wonderful balanced piece in your Substack about what the evidence really says about sleep training. Now, I know this is within your Substack, so I don't want you to have to give everything away, but whatever you do feel comfortable sharing, I would love for my listeners to hear, because I'll just tell you up front, the vast majority of my listeners do lean very holistically. A lot of them already bed share from day one, no issues, and they're very anti-sleep training. I do have actually a small portion who sleep train maybe begrudgingly, like they know it's not the best, but they don't see any other way out. They're sort of desperate, but they're not thrilled about it. So, yeah, anytime someone hears sleep training, it's like, alarms go off, bad. But, okay, so can you tell us about this? What comes to mind? What does the research really say?
Yeah, I think it might be worth just briefly sharing my personal story, because I think it helps situate sort of like where I'm coming from on my skepticism with regard to the data. Mom, like I came from a very crunchy family, but I've always been very scientifically minded, and so I like to call myself scrunchy now, which is like crunchy scientific,
Yeah.
right? But I'm very data driven in both my writing and in how I think about, making decisions as a parent. And so, Emily Oster was my guru coming into my first pregnancy. I know she's a lightning rod for controversy. But, I was like, oh, the evidence says there's no harm from sleep training. And it also seems to show that it really does help mothers get better sleep. Why would I not sleep train? And so I think I had already made up my mind, even before my son was born, that I was going to sleep train when he was developmentally ready, because it just seemed like a good data-driven decision. So I hired a sleep consultant when he was about 6 months, and she recommended Extinction Cry It Out, because she was like, he's big enough, he's strong enough, his weight tracks, and it's safe. And I was like, okay. And it was horrible. It was so horrible. I can't believe I did it. I still can't believe I did it. I don't know why. I mean, I guess it was just it's supposedly safe, and I paid someone to help me with this. And once I had committed, and it did work. After 2 nights of him screaming for hours, he stopped and started sleeping through the night. And it's still one of my biggest regrets. I really regret that parenting decision. That was a bad parenting decision. I don't care what the data says. It was awful. It was an awful experience for me. And I still worry and wonder sometimes whether there weren't some downstream effects. With my daughter, I was like, I'm not going to do this. And I also had a very crunchy doula who was like, well, if you're worried about sleep deprivation, actually bed sharing can be a solution. And I had also started studying hunter-gatherer societies more at that point. Before, I hadn't really considered it an option, but read in some of Sarah Hardy's work. I'm a big fan of her work. I think it was in Mothers and Others, that primate mothers and babies sleeping in close physical contact is it's a primate universal. There are no exceptions. And I was like, wow, this really is profoundly unnatural, the way that we sleep with our babies in separate rooms and cribs. And I guess that was enough to convince me that I ought to at least try bed sharing with my daughter. And in my case, it worked really well. I really loved it. I just really loved that intimacy. it was lovely. I got better sleep. I loved
Yeah.
I loved the snuggles, and I felt really bad that I hadn't done that with my son. So that's my story, and that's why I feel like I have very strong feelings on this topic, and I really do think we need to like loosen the narrative around the dangers of bed sharing. Like, you can do it
Yeah.
safely if you follow the Safe Sleep 7. Like, there can be
Yes.
massive benefits for both mothers and babies, so I'm totally convinced of that. I am, however, very aware of the fact that there are a lot of mothers out there for whom bed sharing doesn't work. Like, they just feel like they really can't get a good night's sleep that way. Their babies are squirmy, they can't get comfortable, like they have hip pain, all kinds of issues. And that, I think that the extremes are bad, right? Like
Yes.
the narrative on the one side that like babies don't really need to, snuggles, and we can just do extreme extinction, cry it out, and no harm. Like, I disagree.
Yeah,
I
same.
also think that the narrative that like any kind of sleep training is bad, and that you have to bed share for like the benefit of your baby's healthy psychological development doesn't really seem to hold up, because honestly, again, like, I am scientifically minded, I am data driven, and when you go and you look at the data, and I agree that there are limitations to some of these studies, but when you look at the data, it does seem to suggest that the psychological benefits of bed sharing are limited compared with just like being a loving and present mother
Yeah.
during the
During the
day.
day.
During the
Right.
day.
Yes.
And that also, you sleep training, as long as it's age appropriate and more gentle than what I did, does seem to both be effective in some cases, and we don't see harm. It's not showing up in the data. Now, should we be skeptical of that data? I think a little bit of healthy skepticism is necessary because, again, it prevents us from doing what I did. And also, I do think that our view of the data should be informed by what I like to call an evolutionary prior. So a prior is basically like in statistical analysis, like you give a certain amount of weight to the results that you would expect based on like other expert information that you have. And I think that given the weight of the evidence that this is really how we evolved to sleep with children,
Yeah.
we should expect to see a whole lot of really high quality data suggesting the contrary
Right.
before we overturn the weight of the evolutionary evidence, right?
Yes. Now, okay, so you said a lot of interesting things there. Now, sometimes a lot of my listeners and I, admittedly, will have some skepticism about who is behind data on either side because every individual is going to have their own subjective biases. We all do, but it's important that we just acknowledge them. And of course, professionally, we should put them aside, right? But is there even a sliver of possibility that maybe there isn't sufficient data supporting negative effects of not or like of gentle sleep training? Is it possible that that could be, I don't know, funded or instigated by the American Academy of Pediatrics because they've been trying to push an agenda since the 1980s of like safe sleep, or is that possible at all? Maybe.
Yeah, I touch about this in my writing on my Substack. Like, I don't think that like this is a conspiracy theory or that like the AAP is blatantly corrupt. Like, I do think they're like trying to like do their best to give good information to the public. And I think that the public does have trouble digesting nuance. Like, when you're
Yes.
giving out public health messages to like a very broad swath of the population, like, it's difficult to be, this is safe, but you have to do this and 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 this. So,
Yeah.
they just have defaulted back to being like, don't do it. And I think part of that also has to do with the fact that we have a very litigious society in America.
Yes.
And so doctors are constantly afraid of having their pantsuit off. And so if the AAP comes out and says, like, it is possible to safely bed share, and actually, if you do it safely, the chances of your child dying in a bed sharing accident are lower than their chances of being struck by lightning in their lifetime. Okay, like, then you have to put all of these qualifiers around the fact that you can't smoke, you can't drink, your partner can't smoke, your partner can't drink. You have to make sure that you have a safe sleep surface, et cetera, et cetera. Your baby should be born at a healthy weight. Like, I think it is too much nuance for it
That's
to
a great point.
be, that said, I think we should be like training and educating individual pediatricians and doctors on, like, if mothers come in and they're just like, I'm so sleep deprived and I am bed sharing, that they're not like shamed for that, or that they're taught how to do it safely. And I also think that it's possible to publish, like, say the general recommendation is not to bed share for most people, but if you have to, here's how to do it safely, because we know that not most people, but many, many, many parents will end up doing it at some point, whether they like it or not. And they do it unsafely because we're not taught how to do it safely, right? So there are a lot of problems with how I think this information is being disseminated. And then, to your question, like, is there formula money involved? I don't think it's the main driving factor, but it's definitely a factor. I mean, the AAP has historically been sponsored by formula companies. They're still sponsored by formula companies. It's not a huge amount of money, but those companies do sponsor important meetings where important decisions are made. And yeah, they have a vested interest in discouraging bed sharing because we know that it makes breastfeeding much harder. Like, we know this.
Yes.
And if breastfeeding success rates are lower, that means more formula sales. And yeah. So yeah, I think it's like, again, it's not a case of like that doctors are being like bribed and bought out. I think it's just that, like, money has influence, right? And like, that money is in there. Nobody wants to annoy the person with the checkbook. People are probably being influenced in ways that they're not even aware of, consciously. So yeah, I mean, I think there should be a barrier. Like, I don't think that the AAP should be allowed to take funding from formula companies, but
Totally. My story was a little bit different in that I was honestly more dogmatic about like pro bed sharing for everyone except for in unsafe situations, because I got obsessed with the book by Dr. James McKenna, Safe Infant Sleep. And I read that during my first pregnancy and I was like, okay, like, if nothing else, I have to bed share for as long as possible for years. And like, it became this almost like this fixation or obsession. And admittedly, there might have even been some judgment, at the time, years ago, like, oh, you don't bed share? Like, why? Like, almost like, let me tell you all about how amazing it was. And now that I have my daughter, who she's popping up and down, between midnight and 6 a.m., I actually was like, I don't want to sleep train, but can we find a way to like gently guide her to a toddler bed a few feet away from our bed so we have that option? Because I was like, oh, this is humbling. Like, whenever you become a mom to a second child, like, everything starts to humble you, like, oh, okay, it's really not as easy as it was with my first. I was like, I don't get it. He's sleeping through. He just pops up one time.
yeah.
She's popping up every 20 minutes. And I get it. I'm like, oh, shoot. Like, I have a lot more empathy now. Like, you don't always get those long, peaceful stretches. And yeah, it can be, what I'm finding is because I have this private community that a lot of moms who they feel a little bit stuck, like they want to do the hunter gatherer things, but we do live in this modern society, or sometimes their desires aren't necessarily aligning directly with their values. Like, I was like, like, should I be moving my daughter to her own bed? Or sometimes I fantasize like it would be nice if she was totally in her own room, and how can I get her to just sleep through the night? And yeah, I feel like that's kind of like the big theme here is we want to figure out how can we incorporate and take like all the good from the hunter gatherers, all the things that are there that have worked for them for a reason, and apply it to our modern Western lives. And it can be challenging.
Yeah, and I would just add to that like we don't really know how things work inside the hut of a hunter-gatherer mother at night because we
True.
don't have good research on this. Like the one study we have is a very small sample size from a population of Hadza hunter-gatherers, and there's interesting data in there, but like I think they used wrist actigraphy devices to like monitor sleep wake patterns. But we don't have any like subjective information about whether or not the mothers might be doing things to like discourage, highly frequent breastfeeding starting around a certain age or encourage children to, sleep more and better or in certain, positions that we just don't know, right? Like I think we do know that once a new baby is born, the older child has to move to the mother's back, right? Like the baby always gets the privileged position, the sacral position at the front. But it's entirely possible because weaning is always mother-led in hunter-gatherer societies. Like it is a misunderstanding that, babies will just voluntarily stop nursing at a reasonable age when they want to. Like even though
Whoa.
nursing is extended, it usually goes till like age 3. The mother is the one that's like, we're done. And it is tantrum city. I mean, children are desperately upset. And so there's nothing unnatural about forcing your child to wean either
Right.
during the day or at night. Like this is what women have done for millions of years.
I'm just in awe. This might be one of the most like truth bomb moments right now because I know there are so many moms like in my sphere who are under the impression, but the misunderstanding really that you just wait for the child. I think we hear about these moms maybe in Mongolia or other parts of the world, not necessarily hunter gatherers. And well, I'm still breastfeeding my 5-year-old. And by the way, no shame
No
if you want to
shame.
do that. Seriously, no shame. Like honestly, good for you. We know the benefits continue to exist. But it is interesting because I have heard of tons of moms in my circle who are like, oh no, you just wait for the child to one day give it up. This is
No,
fascinating.
the standard practice in hunter-gatherer societies is that once the mother becomes pregnant with her next baby, the first baby has to be weaned because calorically it's too expensive for a mother in the hunter-gatherer context to maintain a healthy pregnancy and breastfeed. It like greatly increases the risk of miscarriage, right?
Wow.
Because it's just like there's too much caloric scarcity. So the standard practice is weaning, and this happens, yeah, again, typically around 2.5 or 3 years because the interbirth interval is like 3.5, 4 years, right? So typically the next pregnancy will start around 3 years after the first baby is born, and the weaning process. I mean, it depends on the society, but in some societies, mothers will go to the extent of like putting chili pepper paste on their nipples so that it's spicy and
Whoa.
so that the babies freak out. I mean, these practices can be quite aggressive. But I don't think we're seeing any like long-term psychological harm from this. Like this is
Yeah.
just, like most hunter-gatherers have pretty exceptional mental health.
Yes.
And it's just necessary for the survival of the mother and the healthy continuation of her second pregnancy. So, except in the very, very rare case of twins, like tandem feeding just doesn't exist in traditional societies.
Wow. Oh my gosh, this is so mind blowing. So, whenever we think of tandem feeding, that is very much a modern symptom of like close, of sort of like like that dichotomy I was kind of painting a picture of, like the mom who still wants to be holistic and, of course, breastfeed both babies, but those babies are spaced very closely. She's not ready to wean the older one. That is fascinating.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a poor
No,
choice in the modern
no, no, no.
context where if like again you do have a really close interbirth interval, you feel like your older child still needs that comfort or nutrition, and like, we have very good nutrition in the contemporary context. Like we can
Yeah.
pull it off, you know.
Yes.
But I do also sometimes hear from moms who are like forcing themselves to do it because they think it's natural and necessary, but who instinctively feel a lot of like anger towards their older child continuing to demand the breast. And I'm like, listen to that intuition.
Yes.
That's like a natural sign that your animal self is like ready for this to end so you can focus on your younger child. Like
Yeah.
it's okay for weaning to be mother initiated and mother led.
That gives me a lot of relief, and I think the moms listening to this are going to agree. So I was breastfeeding while pregnant with my daughter. My son, I weaned him at 21 months, and I was 4 months pregnant with my daughter. And I felt so ready. And that was like sort of the turning moment for me of like, oh, this is really humbling me because isn't it so easy to be good at motherhood when you only have like one kid or no kids? And I was always like, well, I'm going to nurse for at least 2 years, but ideally 3. I am like, now I'm weaning you right now. Now, I did it in my way, which I thought some people are going to do the overnight rip the band-aid. I didn't want to do that. It didn't feel right for us or his temperament. We did read books about it. We talked about it. I was already down to just one session a day. So it wasn't 0 to 100. And the thing is, yeah, they're not going to like it no matter what. So whether, because some moms think, well, when they're older and they can verbalize and they can understand it better, it'll be easier. I'm like, I don't know about that. It's like with I'm a potty training consultant too. Some people assume if when they're, this age or that age, it'll be easier. I'm like, it presents a different set of challenges. And then you're dealing with three-nature, manipulation. So this actually gives me a ton of relief. And there's nothing wrong with being an authoritative parent and taking the lead and also knowing like, yeah, they will be pissed off. They will be sad and angry. It's never going to be easy. Okay, this reminded me, you did a reel that was, I'm so glad you did it because I'm sure you got maybe a lot of hate for it. I don't know, but something about alluding to, the farmhouse kind of tradwife archetype. There's ballerina farmhouse on Boone. I don't have to go through all the names, but there is that archetype that we see pop up in our feeds. And like, no hate. I'm just trying to look at this from a hunter-gatherer perspective because there is a little bit of confusion out there. Like, was the natural, biologically normal way for women to just have 8 to 12 kids every 2 years? Like, we do hear that narrative. But then it's like, oh, was it the hunter-gatherer way? So what is your opinion of the tradwife farmhouse mama having the 10 kids every 2 years? What's going on here?
Yeah, gosh, I have such mixed feelings about the tradwife movement, and I don't know if it's a movement, the phenomenon, I guess we should say. I think it is so fascinating how we have seen this recent convergence kind of between like the religious right and the crunchy left. Right? Like, I don't know. That wasn't like a thing for me growing up. These were like two
Same.
very distinct categories, and now they have merged. So I mean, when I look at like Ballerina Farm, everybody loves talking about Ballerina Farm because Hannah Nealman, because she's the most famous one, and because there was this viral Times article about her, so we know a little bit more about sort of the intimate details of her life. I'm personally quite fascinated with her.
Same.
I mean, I am like, wow, she's awesome and beautiful, and I do think that there are elements of her lifestyle that are very aspirational. And on the other hand, yeah, it is not normal from an evolutionary perspective to have 8 children 15 months apart. Like, I think she's my age. I think she's like 30. She's like 35, 36, something like this.
Yeah.
And she has 8 kids already. So they are very closely spaced. And that's because I think they don't believe in birth control, right?
Yeah. I think Mormon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how they do things, but my understanding is that they don't, and that that's just kind of the timing of how it works out if you breastfeed. I also have spoken with other mothers from religious circles who for whom breastfeeding didn't work out. And in the absence of birth control, they end up stacking babies sometimes like 6 months apart. This is objectively dangerous for your body, for your health, like not good. So, and even in hunter-gatherer societies, I think we do see like taboos around intercourse for a certain amount of time following childbirth. Like, I think whether it's through birth control or cultural norms, like mothers need to be able to protect themselves from getting pregnant too quickly in the contemporary context where body mass index is higher, breastfeeding fails, like it's not evolutionarily normal to have children 1 year apart, 2 years apart. It's debatable. 3 or 4 years, I think, is better. And then the other thing is just that, again, because of reasons around, I think, body mass index, mainly hunter-gatherer women didn't get their first periods until they were about 17 or 18, didn't become fertile until they were 19 or 20. The average age of first birth is 20 years old, even in the absence of birth control. That's really when a woman's body is physiologically ready for a first pregnancy. But you see, I think, very young teen girls sometimes in these Orthodox religious circles, having babies at really young ages. This is not good for a woman's body.
Right.
So, yeah. And then the other thing is that because of the long birth interval and because usually fertility in these populations tapers off quite quickly around age like 40, 45, they're only having about 4 or 5 children. And also, unfortunately, rates of child mortality were quite high, which is certainly not something that we want to replicate in the modern context. It's one of the reasons for why I'm quite grateful to live in contemporary society. Mm-hmm. But realistically, what that meant was that like another 30% of children were going to be lost in the first year. So the children that you're actually raising to adulthood, maybe 3, like family size was small. Like, and we know this had to be the case because the human population was fairly stable prior to agriculture. Like, we didn't see any of these population booms and busts that we started seeing after humans settled down and started planting crops. So we know that the average family size had to be small. We know it can't be a long-standing feature of, for women to have been having families of 12.
So one of the things that we're often told from the families with a ton of kids is, well, the benefit is like the more kids, like the happier, the more best friends every sibling has. Like the blessings just keep multiplying. Is there, I know obviously this is such a personal experience from family to family, but is there validity to that needs to be acknowledged? But also, in your opinion, with your research background, what are the ramifications of a family having like 8 to 12 kids, even if they are very loving parents?
Yeah, I mean, because I think the other thing that we haven't really touched on here is that in the hunter-gatherer context, they practice something called alloparenting, or some researchers call it cooperative breeding. Like, the entire community is taking a very active role in raising the children. So mothers have tons of helpers. Some evolutionary biologists have said that the norm in hunter-gatherer societies is for the ratio of available caregivers to children to be about 10 to 1.
I would love that. Sign me up.
Right? I mean, that, I think, more than anything else explains why motherhood is harder in the contemporary context than it ever used to be, right? Like, we have lost that network. And this is also the reason, by the way, that evolutionary biologists believe that humans were able to evolve a shorter interbirth interval relative to our great ape cousins, is, even though our children are more dependent, is because we evolved this cooperative child rearing. It's like a long-standing feature of human existence. It's baked into our DNA. Like, it's not that we're just like missing the village and that this happened in the last 200 years. Like, no, for 99 of our history as a species, we were raising children cooperatively, and it's like a fundamental piece of human behavior that we've just managed to erase in contemporary society by moving everyone into, single family homes. So yeah, that makes things so much harder. And it also means that children, even in a loving home, especially when they're competing with multiple siblings, are not getting nearly the level of attention, I think, that they evolved to expect. And so, we do we do have data on this, and I think the data generally suggests that children do not fare as well when they come from really large families of closely spaced siblings. That there certainly are benefits to having siblings. I think having a sibling is a gift. I love my own brother. I never wanted to have an only child. I always wanted my kids to have siblings. And on the other hand, I do see that just the level of competition and jealousy between my two, given that my husband, has always been busy with work and I have often been their only available caregiver, it's natural that they're fighting and competing for my exclusive attention, and it can make family dynamics really stressful. So I can't imagine what it's like if you have a family of 8, although what I will say is that in hunter-gatherer societies, children actually very quickly become competent caregivers themselves, much earlier than in our society. So some of the evidence seems to indicate that as early as age 7, a child
It's incredible.
can be a competent, sensitive caregiver of a baby, not for long stretches, but that actually care of younger children by older children was one of the things that really enabled mothers to continue going out and foraging for food without always having to take their toddlers along, because they're cared for by the older children. And so I do think that in families like Ballerina Farm, where once you start getting to a point where some of the older children are capable caregivers of the younger children, it can actually be easier in some ways than having a family of 2 under 2, or my grandmother did 4 under 6. That is insanity. My maternal grandmother actually came, she was I think the 12th of 13 kids. But her experience was, she was I just never saw my mother. I was raised by my older siblings.
Wow.
So I don't know, is that good for kids? She seems relatively well adjusted. I do think it was probably easier for her than it was for number 3.
Yes.
Right? And that it was maybe in some ways easier for her mother, and is easier for women. Ballerina Farm, if you think about it, we don't have any content from her when she had 3 under 6. All of the content comes from later, after there were older children around, and you see it in the photos. You see her oldest boy carrying the baby around, helping out. You kind of create your own crew. And so I'm not suggesting that people should have huge families like that. I still think it's not ideal, especially in the contemporary context. But I do think that if you start your family early and you space your children 3 or 4 years apart, then in an ideal world, if you're having 3 kids or 4 kids, by the time your third comes along, your oldest is 7 or 8, your oldest can already be more of a caregiver in some ways than a care receiver. I always get accused of promoting parentification when I talk about this, but I do think it's good for kids to pitch in,
It totally is. I know. I see those comments across lots of different people's accounts, and I'll just say this. My mom had me at 25. Then she had my brother at 30. It was planned. And she tells me now, she's I'm glad I have the self-awareness to realize that with she's speaking to me, your temperament, I was bossy or whatever. She's I knew I could not handle another one that soon. She's like, I needed to give myself a break. And by the time your brother came, it was easy. I was not multitasking. I wasn't juggling things. She's like, you were in kindergarten. I was at home on the couch breastfeeding him. Like, there was enough of me to go around. And she's like, that was my capacity. And it was very unusual, even in 90 and 95, to do it that way. But so she was the oddball out, but I can totally see that. And I loved being like a mommy junior to my brother. With that age gap, I wanted to be like, oh, the babysitter, the helper. Like, I loved helping my mom, and I wanted to learn all about this role. I was like the mom intern. So that was cool. We did not have that close bond, like we're best friends. I protected him, I defended him, I cared a lot about him, but it was never, so I never had that best friend type of sibling that everyone always talks about. Okay, so then this leads me into my next question, which was Mom Donnie in New York was talking about free childcare. And I think you recently did a reel about that. And so can you talk to us about that? I know people are going to have very strong feelings one way or the other. And there's, I mean, for example, I put my son into a very part-time half-day preschool, which we love, when he was 18 months old. Even though I'm a stay-at-home mom, we started off with just 2 half-days a week, then 3, and now 5. And like, he loves it. And my daughter's still at home with me at a year and a half. But whenever I think of free anything, and we are moving to Sweden where everything is free, but whenever I hear free, it's just you're funding it, it's taxpayer funded. So there's no such thing as really free, but it is an interesting way to look at it. And sometimes I get nervous when I hear free, like, what's the quality going to be, right? Because you get what you pay for situation. And I do like having some control and say over things. I don't mind paying a little bit. So yeah, talk to us about free childcare.
Okay, so this is a really lightning rod of a topic. Let me start by saying that I am not in the Erica Commissar Club of like children need exclusive maternal presence for the first 3 years of their life. I think that's nonsense. I think if you look again to how mothering is done in hunter-gatherer societies, children are raised collectively from day one. In some of these societies, like in the Aita of the Philippines, there have been research studies that have shown that even for infants, so like children under the age of 2, mothers are doing only 25% of the active childcare. So children are being transferred. I mean, in some societies, it's like they're transferred among caregivers 8 times per hour. Again, I cited this 10-to-1 ratio. There's collective breastfeeding in some of these societies. Babies are passed around and nursed by multiple lactating women. It is not natural for a mother to be trapped alone in a single family home with 1 baby, let alone 2, let alone 3. So yeah, I mean, I am a big breastfeeding advocate. I think that proximity to your baby is obviously, necessary if you want breastfeeding success.
Yes.
Especially in the early months. I think children benefit enormously from having lots of quality time with their mothers in the first year. I do not think that you have to do it alone. I don't think you were meant to do it alone. However, the quality of the care that your child is getting from others matters. Children need sensitive caregiving, right? Like in hunter-gatherer societies, the collective caregiving is extremely sensitive and responsive. Children are never left to cry. So I do think that based on our evolutionary history and also just based on the evidence of, too much time in daycare and outcomes in the contemporary context, the evidence is mixed, especially for very young babies, and quality is everything. And when we say quality, I really mean the quality of the available caregivers. So what is the ratio of available caregivers to children? There should be a very high ratio. The higher the ratio, the better, right? The more caregivers per baby, the better. And also, how attuned and sensitive are those caregivers to the baby's needs? Like, forget Montessori philosophy and organic snacks. Like, it does not matter. I mean, maybe it matters a little bit on the margins, but the thing that matters if you need a daycare and you're assessing the quality of a daycare is how many people are present and involved and affectionately attuned to the needs of my child. So my son was in daycare from 6 months old, and I have no regrets about that because the daycare I sent him to was a family daycare that was in my neighborhood, and the woman was excellent. And she only had like 4 toddlers and 2 babies, and her husband also helped, and her older child also helped, and they were all just so loving and wonderful. And I was like, there was no doubt in my mind that my son was getting the care he needed in that facility. Like, they had a separate room for naps for the babies that had only 2 cribs in it, so he was napping a lot. And then we moved, and I had to switch him into this like institutional daycare because that was the only thing that had space. And it was like 12 cribs in a room for babies. Of course, they're all screaming their heads off. Of course, he didn't sleep. He wasn't napping. We lasted 1 month there, and then I was like, forget it. Like, this is not okay. Like, I could see that he was not okay. Like, I was like, how can people... I guess it's just because people have no choice. You know, I was just, how can you leave your child in a center like this and not have your heart break? Like, it's just, but so blanket statements about daycare being good or bad, I think, you know, there's a lot of important qualifiers. It depends on the quality of the center. It depends on the age of the child. It depends on the child's temperament. It depends on lots of factors. But I think it's safe to say that low quality centers for very young babies and children are a risk. Yes. We see this, and we see, so the study everyone likes to talk about, because it was a very damning study, was the rollout of universal childcare in Quebec, where they did this very fast, because it was a very popular program, and it had very positive effects on women's labor force participation. It helped many families lift themselves out of poverty. So there were like positive effects of this program. But then when they followed up on like the effects of the children, they were not good. Like, it harmed parent-child attachment. Like, these children grew up to have like lower life satisfaction, higher rates of, you know, mental illnesses, and even higher rates of criminality. Those findings have been questioned, but still, like, the correlation is there. So it was a very damning study, and I think the reason that it was so harmful was because they rolled it out really fast, and they didn't have the guardrails around quality in place. And so a lot of kids were going to centers that were just understaffed. The quality wasn't there. They were being left to cry it out for hours. We know that kids need sensitive caregiving. You know, you can't, like, childcare of babies just doesn't scale in that way. And so I'm very worried that, like, in the US, especially on the left, there's like this huge rallying cry around affordable childcare. And I understand where that's coming from, because parents are super financially stressed.
Yeah.
And childcare puts a huge hole in your budget. But like in New Mexico, they just started guaranteeing like affordable or free childcare for every family, starting at, I think you can qualify when your baby is only 6 weeks old, and they don't have any kind of state leave. So there's no state leave, there's no federal leave. So, and you can say, oh, well, like, mothers can still choose to use it or not. No, mothers are not, this is not a choice for many mothers. Like, if you are in the bottom quartile of like the socioeconomic demographic, right? Yeah. Like, you, and suddenly free childcare is available, there is going to be enormous pressure on you to enroll your child and go get a job. Because so sad. Because, you know, it makes a huge difference to the family's finances. But then what are the costs for children? And what are the costs for mothers? Because this also affects parent well-being. That also showed up in the data, like decrease in maternal and parent well-being, right? So, yeah, I just don't want us to make this same mistake. And it's really frustrating to me that whenever I say, like, I think that that we should be careful with these policies, I get piled on, because it's just kind of this like idea that like that like affordable childcare must be good. I'm like, I would rather see that money invested in longer paid leave programs
Yes.
and also in preschool
Sure.
because starting at age 3, the data shows children do much better when they're, away from their mothers and from their families for long stretches. We can afford to have a much lower, ratio of caregivers to children, lower ratio, higher ratio. We can afford to have fewer
Or lower,
caregivers.
yeah.
Yeah.
Or higher. Yes, yes. Wait, it would
Compared
be
to
a higher ratio.
children.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know. Math is not my thing.
More of English and reading. No, so I love everything you said. Yeah, because the Erica Commissar thing, I wish we had time to go down that rabbit hole. I know we're up on time, but lately I've been agreeing more with that too. Just everything you said makes sense. In Sweden, for example, each parent gets mandatory 8 months of paid leave. And they wouldn't dream of having mothers back in the workforce and having babies in a preschool at 6 weeks old. They know that's bad for breastfeeding and bonding and all sorts of postpartum disorders. So, yeah, I'm with you. Like, if we're going to use taxpayer dollars, let's put it towards something that is good for mother, baby, and society, which is not putting a baby in a daycare at 6 weeks old. And longer leave makes sense. So, okay, wow, lots of great takes here. This was so
Thank you.
eye-opening and fun. I love having these conversations, and it was so cool to
Yeah,
have you on.
likewise.
Yeah,
Likewise. I really
yeah,
enjoyed it.
yes. Maybe we can do like a part 2 in the future.
Certainly. I'd love
Yeah,
that.
yes. Now tell everyone where they can find you and follow you.
Yes, so my Substack is called Motherhood Until Yesterday. So, yeah, that's where the magic really happens because I think a lot of this stuff, as I hope you got from this podcast, is pretty complicated, pretty nuanced. So I'm also on Instagram at Elena.Bridgers, but I think what's just hard about Instagram is it's hard to convey like the necessary nuance around these things
Yeah.
in short form posts and reels and, to do a good job of citing sources and data. So yeah, I really encourage people who are deeply interested in these topics to, find me on Substack. I publish a mix of free and paid stuff, and yeah, it's generally a good community of diverse people with diverse opinions, but who are tolerant of one another.
Yes, which I so appreciate too. It's so hard to find that in the algorithms. It's just a bunch of keyboard warriors usually, but I really appreciate how you bring together people from all sides of the political and socioeconomic spectrum all over the world, and you speak to them so respectfully. And I recently subscribed to your Substack. I've been raving about it in my private community, so definitely go check Elena out on Substack, sorry, and subscribe.
Thank you, Catherine. Thanks
Yes,
so much
of
for having me
course.
on.
Of course, thank you. All right, until next time.